Good evening.
Hi.
Welcome to Genesis Global Spiritual Center. We are a community, a spiritual community, and our unique contribution to the world is that we are founded on unconditional love. And what that means for us is that we are always connecting heart to heart, soul to soul, mind to mind, with ourselves, with the people around us. And that is really how we came to this place tonight. Was this community, when I introduce Edward, you'll probably hear this community yell very loudly, adored Bishop Edward Donalson, and I was invited to meet him by many people in the community. Oh, you have to meet this man, you have to meet this man. And the first time we'd set up an appointment, I missed it, and the next time I said, well, let's meet, and now I have an agenda. And what I told him is, I have this idea. And he said, that's fabulous. I said, great, now you fill in all the blanks. All I had was the idea. And that's how we came up with Curated Conversations. It's going to happen monthly, the third Tuesday of every month. This quarter, we're going to talk about race. Next quarter, it will be religion, then sexuality, and then politics. And so we're going to talk about all those things that we're afraid to talk about with our friends and with our family. And so before we start, what I'd like to do is just kind of set the tone. So if you just get comfortable for a minute, you can close your eyes if you choose, you don't have to. And so I just call in that power, that presence, that oneness that I choose to call God, that is known by so many different names. And I know that one lives in and through and as me, in and through and as all people everywhere. All things everywhere. There is no separation, there's just the one, and we are all part of that. And so knowing that energy that flows in and through and as me and goes out and touches the hearts and souls of everyone around me, my job is to show up and be kind and be compassionate. And that's why we're starting this conversation. That is the invitation to each one of you. Be kind, be passionate, be compassionate. And so with that, we just know this evening is going to be juicy. It's going to be filled with great conversation, laughter, maybe some tears, and I just know all of us are going to come closer together as a community, as one. And so with that, I just say thank you, God. And together we say, and so it is. Amen. So please welcome to the stage Bishop Edward Donalson.
I am so excited to be back with Genesis. It feels like it's been forever since I've been with you. It has. But hey, how y'all doing? But I'm so glad to be back with you and to have some friends tonight. I'm really excited about these wonderful women that are joining me in this process this evening. And I'm excited that each of you are here expressing as yourselves, being fully alive and fully ready to engage this dialogue and this conversation. So I'm going to ask the ladies to join me on stage, and then we'll do some introductions here. I'll help whomever's coming first.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Oh, you're going to sit on this side? All right. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. Let me do this properly because I really want you to know who these wonderful women are. To my left is Jean Adler Stean, and I will tell you a little bit about Jean Adler Stean. She graduated from the University of Virginia with a BA in Religious Studies and from Duke Divinity with her Master's of Divinity. She's an ordained deacon in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Yeah, right? And she is currently assistant pastor at Ebenezer AME Zion here in the beautiful city of Seattle. She works at Seattle University, where she is the assistant director of admissions. Yes, I have that right. And after this, we'll talk about who the director is. But that's neither here nor there. We love her. She's from Virginia Beach originally, and she's been married for 3 years whoop, whoop, to her seminary sweetheart. And she says that's not really a thing. She made it up. but it's really awesome. And she just started veggie gardening. So she's the proud plant mama of tomatoes, zucchinis, cucumbers, and there's some leafy greens on the way, which sounds like an invitation for some sort of salad party at Jean's house. Her favorite foods include chocolate, biscuits, and peaches. So now you know a little bit about Jean, and we're going to have a lot of fun with Jean tonight. The lady who happens to be sitting to my right, I know pretty well. And after all this time coming to Genesis, I finally get to introduce you to my spouse. This is Ujima Donaldson. And she has been my spouse for 18 years. And we've been hanging around together for 22 years. And yeah, we've been having a lot of fun. She attended Seattle University, where she graduated with her Bachelor's of Arts in Communication Studies and also earned her master's degree in adult education. She was an assistant vice president for Bank of America for 15 years. And for the past 10 years, she's been working at the University of Washington, and she is currently executive director of professional organizational development for the University of Washington. Yay! Let's see. Together we teach at the University of Washington cultural competency, and she directs all of the adult education programming for staff and faculty there. She is the proud mother of a 12-year-old daughter who we happen to share, which is probably a good thing. Also my daughter, because if you do the math. Anyway, it doesn't always work out that way, but we happen to share a 12-year-old daughter named Heaven. She's a lover of music. She's an amazing singer, dancer, actress, you name it, she does it. She's the it girl in the universe. She makes it all happen. So we are glad to be here tonight. For those of you who don't know, I am the Director of Liturgy and Worship at Seattle University currently, and the Senior Pastor of Kingdom Family Worship Center International in Kent, Washington. So that's a little bit about us. And Jean, would you like to say something to greet the people or open up, or should we dive right in?
Greetings. That's all I have.
She's a woman of many words. Would you like to say anything?
I just would like to say thank you for such a warm welcome. I already feel at home, and I'm excited for our conversation this evening.
So the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask a couple questions, and we're going to have some dialogue up here to kind of get the conversation moving forward. And then after that, we'll open it up to you for questions. There's a microphone over here. You could just step to this mic right here and share your question. If you're a little shy about sharing your question, hey Jamel, how you doing? If you're a little shy, Jamel's a MAPS student at Seattle University, Masters of Art in Pastoral Studies. If you're a little shy about saying your question or would be more comfortable writing it down, we do have some cards. Note cards, and just raise your hand at any point and someone will bring you a card and I will read the questions and then we'll discuss them. Does that work for everybody? Most excellent. I'm so glad that we're doing this. So let's jump right in. Let's talk. Race. It's that word in every room that takes the air out of every room. In our current cultural climate, it seems to be one of the most loaded topics. And I want to commend Genesis for starting this series at a difficult place. And we acknowledge that it can be a difficult place. But the question really is, how do we define race? When we talk about race, what is race? And I think for me, this is for me, that race is a social construct, right? Genomists will tell you there's no genetic reality to what we define as race. So I want to just take the burden off of you when we say white people and Black people. These are not genetically hardwired, coded realities, right? They're cultural constructs that we live with and work with. And whiteness isn't really about the color of skin. Whiteness is about a structure of power and dominance and privilege. And it happened at Ellis Island. It's not your ethnic heritage. So I want to ask Jean, how do you define race? What is it, and how do you enter into the conversation?
Yeah, so I would say that race is similar to what you're talking about. I echo that. It's a system that runs in institutions, in our culture, in politics, economics, that has real lived experience consequences. And those consequences are that there's certain groups of people that get privilege, and there's other groups of people that get oppression, usually based on physical appearance and often skin color, but also physical attributes as well. And just to be clear, when we talk about who's getting the privilege, that would be white people, and who's getting oppressed would be everybody else, so people of color more broadly. I liked that you mentioned Ellis Island, because one of the ways that helps me to sort of think about race historically and the fact that it didn't just come out of nowhere but was constructed, I like to think about my grandfather. And so his name was Hans Henry Hermann Christian Adler. Got all those names. Good, strong German name, and he came over from Ellis Island when he was a boy, probably about 4 or 5 years old. And as I started to learn about his history and therefore my history, I also learned about what it meant for him to come over here as a German boy, and at the time was very much still German. What we know as white didn't really exist yet, so there was still racial tensions between whites and between Germans and Italians and Polish and all of that. But over time, he's now white. And there's a lot of history and a lot of systems, that structures that went into the making of him becoming white and of me becoming white. I could say that I'm German, and I am, but that doesn't really mean much to me culturally in this context of the United States. And that really is quite a powerful structure that's happened in not very lot of time. So
That's really powerful to share the history of how your family moved from being German to being white, and to center it in the United States culture and United States history. Because when you go to places in South America, there are races of people, whole races of people who all share melanin. And so they're all what we would term black people, but because there are variations in their skin color, they see themselves as completely different races. And the construct is particular to their community and to their region. And so that's a really important gift. Thank you for bringing that. Why don't you talk a little bit, lady, about what racism is what race is and how you enter that conversation?
Glad you started from race.
Yeah,
Didn't
let's
just
start there.
jump me right into racism. That's lovely.
I'll take you the slow way.
Okay, great. Well, race, I think I start from the same place that you do, in that race is a social construct, in that there are not, because our genes mutate ever so often, very difficult to find the biological components that construct race as once was determined several hundreds of years ago. But I enter the stream in the race conversation with other definitions, and race is also defined as a vast group of people loosely bound together by historically contingent and socially significant elements of ancestry. So when we say things like black people, they typically would share the ancestry of what we would know as slavery. And so that loosely binds, but do we know contextually what it really means to be black, or what it means to be African American, or what it means to be white? I think there's various ways of slicing and kind of dicing that pie. It's also important to note that Congress and the Supreme Court's understanding of race is exemplified by a 1988, I just want to take you back just a few years, 1988 statute that explains that racial group means a set of individuals that share distinctive physical characteristics or even biological descent. So we could be grouped because we simply look alike. So Pastor Gayle and I look similar. Our facial structure is round, our noses are similar, our lips are similar in size. So you and I could be racially grouped together. And we have a nice little part in our hair. So I wanted to show how there are arbitrary bases of codifying, systematic ways of codifying folks, to classify them, to sort them into categories of kind of good, better, best, if you will. That is the purpose that race has served for us over time. I think those were the points I wanted to make.
Thank you.
About race.
Thank you.
Well, I will say, if I can, my journey with race has been interesting and dynamic over the years, because I went on a search to find out in my family when we were colored, because I have so many groups of folk in my family who are white, French, Caribbean, but as I looked through my ancestry, many of my ancestors were noted as mulatto, and that term will probably come up, but I went on a journey to find out, well, darn, when were we just colored? Like, when did that start? And there are some historical elements that are defined in there that I think are important to really think about with race. As long ago as 1790, race categories entered into the first census. And so while we are codifying, it's important to remember that it was just 1790 that happened. Naturalization was reserved just for whites in 1790. In 1830, First Nations were depossessed of their land. In 1854, Frederick Douglass challenged race scientists who were trying to prove to us that this idea of race was real based on brain size. In 1857, African Americans were denied citizenship, but then in 1868, the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal rights and granted citizenship to blacks. But on the heels of that, in 1887, Jim Crow segregation begins. So, there's so many touch points in our history that deal with this thing called race, that we're talking about something much larger than the color of our skin.
Thank you. It's important to note that historical progression of how our racial classes and racial divisions begin to play out socially. One of the things, we've used a few terms that are common in the conversation around race that I personally push back against. One of those terms is Jim and Jane Crow. We talk about the system of racial apartheid in America as Jim and Jane Crow, giving it personhood, as though there were two people who were racist in America that were Jim and Jane Crow, and we can put off our collective bad behavior off on this personification of evil, when the reality is what we had was systemic racialized apartheid. And our ability to make judgments against the continent of Africa for the exact same behavior that we displayed as a nation, that we have been unapologetic and unrepentant for, that continues to move forward, is made easy because we personify race. The other one that I kind of wanted to push back on is people of color, which has become a really common and normative way of discussing race and racism. So there's white people and there's people of color. And the problem with people of color is that it erases my lived experience. It is a project of white liberal erasure that happens when we lump all people who are non-white into this category called people of color, and it centers whiteness as norm. And for me, I struggle that whiteness is normative, but I should also say that, quiet as it's kept, I'm not African American. I'm not African American. My experience is not hyphenated. I am a black man and fully embody that blackness. I am what the Ma'afa produced. I'm what slavery produced. I'm what segregated apartheid in America produced. I'm what Howard University produced. I'm what Spelman College produced. I am a product of the American project in race. And so my experience is centered in that reality of blackness. Now, that's not across the board. Are you black? I don't know what you are.
I'm actually Blasian,
Okay.
however.
This is good. I should know
My,
these
my
things.
you know that I'm, what am I? I'm Blasian, you know that.
Oh.
My grandfather is Filipino, so my experience is a hyphenated experience. My husband identifies as black, and I may identify as African American or an Asian black American or a black Asian American. Our daughter actually identifies as Asian American.
Yes, she checks the
Which
box.
is very compelling because she's a beautiful little chocolate girl. And I'm sure she confuses the people at school when she identifies as Asian American.
And she has that right. She can name her truth for herself. And she's big. Did I cut myself off?
I think my foot hit something back here. Hold on. It wasn't you.
It wasn't me. Okay, good. So I'll just speak a little louder. She identifies with that Filipino part of her lived reality. And she identifies with it very deeply and intrinsically, and we don't correct that because that's her experience that she has the right to name for herself. And so I did ask her, however, I said, oh, you're Asian American? She said, yes. I said, well, what is daddy? She said, a black man. I said, oh, okay, I'm a black man and you're Asian. She said, yes, and we live in this house. Are you with me? Right? Because that's how she gets to name her. So here's the talk about race, that there are no pat answers.
Right.
There are no all black people feel this way, or all white people feel this way, or all Asian people feel this way. So the best way to have conversation and dialogue is to engage a person as a person.
Right.
And ask them particular to who they are, grounded in their lived embodiment. I gave that back like I was done talking. But I have another question for Eugene. My wife said I went too fast, so I'm going to come over here to you. What's racism? And how do you talk about racism?
Well, just a light question. Racism is what we've been naming. I think that you so eloquently named too throughout our history. Sorry, I got distracted. Yes, racism is the system by which we oppress people, and I've heard your argument before about saying people of color. And I appreciate that. It's definitely opened my eyes. I don't have a better way to name everyone right now. Okay, so help me out if with that too, if you can. So yes, a system that oppresses people of color and privileges white people. So I am a white person, that's how I identify, and so I therefore experience privilege in the world, in our culture, particularly in the United States. It doesn't matter that I didn't ask for it, it doesn't matter historically if my family, are from Germany or from wherever they're from. I live in the United States, I look white, I am white, and therefore I have privileges that I walk around with every day and often don't even recognize because I'm so conditioned to it that it just feels like breathing.
Jean, one of the things that, as a coworker, I have noticed and had the benefit of experiencing is your ability to name when a moment is racist. In ways that from a place of privilege or from a place of power, you give voice to very differently than a person from a marginalized community. Which I guess is my comeback to people of color. I tend to refer to them as marginalized people or people experiencing marginalization. And never minority, minoritized possibly, but never. But anyway, you really name racism. Where does that come from? How did you get to that place? How did you learn to see it? How did you learn to name it? Where did that courage come from?
Well, I'm still learning to see it, and I'm still learning to name it, so I want to start with that. I appreciate you sharing that with me, because it means a lot to hear that from you, because I try, but also I mess up, so I'll start with a place of humility there. Yeah, it's been a long journey and will continue to be a long journey. I'm grateful to have been able to participate in things like this before, having gone to different racial equity trainings where folks that are way more knowledgeable than I am and have studied this for years and years share their wisdom and share their knowledge about what it means to be white in America and to open up my eyes to the privilege that I didn't see. And continuing to, another thing that's been really important is to read books, to read articles, particularly from the perspective of marginalized people, so that I can begin to understand what I don't know. That's maybe been the biggest thing, is because I just, walk around in the skin that I'm in, I sometimes don't even know what I don't know. So having to hear from and learn from other perspectives has been invaluable in opening up my eyes. And I emphasize reading books because I want to make sure that I'm not putting the impetus on marginalized people to teach me. And I know that I've done that before, but I'm trying to learn from that. So that it really is, I have to take it upon myself to pursue that. And I'm grateful for people in my life who are not white that have also, loved me by sharing with me the things that I don't see as well. I'm grateful for that. And it's a lot of, I need to continue to do the work. And that's something that also feels like racism to me. The fact that I can choose whether or not I want to engage with a conversation about racism or engage with my own racism. And there are days where I've made the choice to not engage. And certainly not everyone gets to do that. So that's also just ignored.
Thank you very much. How do you enter the conversation around racism? How would you define racism?
I think I enter the conversation at the place where we define what an ism is, right? With any ism, when there is a group of folk who fancy themselves more superior than others in any position, whether that be language, where we experience linguicism because we presume that we are more superior with our use of language, whether that be classism, whether that be, so from that space I enter the racism conversation and start with my thoughts in that space of thinking about times where I have even felt persuaded to feel more superior than others. But I do understand that because race is a social construct and attached to systems and systems of government and power structures, that racism isn't to be handled lightly, and we can say, and you've been a racist, and you've been a racist, and like Oprah's, you get a car, and you get a car. But rather, it is only enacted by those who are in power. And so I think that's important to consider in the racism conversation as well. If you don't have power, then your prejudice really isn't as visible at times, or as notable at times as others.
Thank you for bringing that forward and to the fore of the conversation, because there is this conversation and dialogue that we hear in spaces about reverse racism, and that's an impossibility, right? There is no such thing as reverse racism, because racism includes power, right? And so people on the underside of power that are not at the center, those on the margins, cannot be racist. Now, that doesn't mean they cannot be prejudiced.
Right.
Let's be clear, they can be prejudiced. And sometimes that prejudice is informed by experience. But the reality is they're not racist. We were driving down the street some time ago, and I oversee a few churches, and one of the pastors had said to me, Bishop, your classism is showing. You're a bit of an elitist. And so I was sharing with my wife, I said, can you believe he said I was classist and elitist? And she looked over at me and she said, and you didn't know this about yourself.
He's working on it.
I am working on it. Because I said, I'm not classist. I'm not classist at all. And I'm not elitist. And I resent that. And she said, oh, okay, all right. How you see yourself there? Well, I said, I work for the poor. She said, and that's why you're classist. Because you work for the poor. You don't work with the poor.
Wow.
There's a difference.
Wow.
And I said, oh, I'm classist and elitist, and I need help, right? Like, you have to just own that and admit that, because poor people can't be classist. That doesn't mean they don't have negative feelings about people with wealth.
Exactly.
Or about being poor. And they may not even like other poor people.
That's right.
But they are not classist and elitists, because they are on the underside of power. And until we really understand how much racism is attached to power, we'll continue to be offended by words and terminologies that we have our own private definition of.
Right, and I think that one of the things that you just mentioned brings up the idea of oppression sickness.
Yes.
Right, with poor people that don't like other poor people, or you experience black folk that don't like other black people, or, right, and so when you have these groups of marginalized people who seem to enact what would be called a reverse ism, oftentimes what they're experiencing is this oppression sickness. It is the internalized feeling of, I've drank the water that says this is better and this is more preferred, and now this is what I then want to be and aspire to and espouse my beliefs and bring my whole clan into this ideology. And I think that's important. And oftentimes we don't see it. Robyn D'angelo is a wonderful educator here in the Pacific Northwest. She comes out of the University of Washington, but she talks a lot about white fragility. And she speaks from the place as a white woman, educating other white women and men, talking about the thing that Jean brought up, like white privilege, it being something that you don't even see, right? Being like the air you breathe. Robyn D'angelo talks about it, like she uses the analogy of water. Like when you're in the water, you don't notice because you're in the water. Many of you have been swimming, right? And when you're swimming, you don't notice even the temperature of the water, you don't notice other things because you're so far in it. And there are expectations in the water that you don't expect on land. And so Robyn gets into those very same things. That's how we end up well-to-do, well-intentioned, good people who end up racist, right? Because we all want to believe we're good people for whatever that means. Dr. Greenwald wrote a book, The Hidden Biases of Good People. So I guess I'm much like you. I believe leaders are readers. So there's a lot of research that goes into this. Anytime you challenge yourself in this work, starting from that place of humility and sparking that place of curiosity, but knowing that there's a lot of ways to enter the stream.
When you surface the idea of internalized oppression sickness, Dr. Yvette Flender writes about oppression sickness in the LGBTQ community and the multiple burden of what it means to be queer and black and what that oppression and that internalized oppression is about. But Dr. Joy DeGruy writes about sustained, well, what she called post-traumatic slave disorder. We've moved a bit past her work because the trauma of racism in America is not something you can be post. So really we're now talking about prolonged traumatic slave disorder. That what happens when a people group, black people in particular, or indigenous people, live with the effects of a supremacist culture for multiple generations, and how that gets in the fabric, in the weft, in the weave of a particular culture, and oppressed people learn how to oppress.
That's right.
Right?
Really good at it.
They get really good at oppression.
Better at it.
Much better at it. And so there are ways in which, I'm a product of the black church. There are ways in which the black church has been guilty of being an oppressive space for women.
That's right.
Because in an attempt to reify white supremacist heteropatriarchy, what we did in the black church was we said, well, at least our women are subject. So the black male king, the dominant, right, has to keep women subjected in order to mirror the dominant culture and mirror that society to produce acceptability. And the myth of acceptability. And it's a politic of respectability. But it never worked for us because it was never our system. It's not intrinsic to who we are. And so it didn't work in the church, it didn't work in our families, it doesn't work for our culture at all. Let me move, because we just have a couple minutes and there's so many more questions to get to. But there's two questions I want to ask. The first I want to lift, and they're for both of you, and either of you can just jump in on either question. Why do racial conversations always boil down to black and white? It's the first question, as though there are no other races. And then the second one, and you can jump in on either one, how do you define then, we've talked about white privilege, which I offer pushback on. I offer pushback on everything we attach privilege to, because my lived experience and my research tells me that it's really supremacy. What we want to be talking about is male supremacy, white supremacy, et cetera, academic supremacy.
He's such a fist pumper.
I am.
I'm sorry.
right?
You go hard.
I go hard, too. But so those are my two questions. Why do racial conversations always boil down to black and white? And then how do you then deal with, define, work with what is white supremacy?
I'd like to take a stab at the boil down to black and white. I think one of the reasons why the conversation boils down to black and white is particularly because of where we sit, not just Western culture, but particularly American, that many of our laws and governance happen around this race line of what is then white and what is then black. And so much of the advances that we want to make as marginalized people happen on the backs of and come in through the door of race. And historically, what happened to people who have what our government defines as the one-drop rule. I know you didn't come for a history lesson, but before we classified and codified people, the curiosity wasn't so much around First Nations folks or even Asian people and how the Mongoloid, I hate that terminology, and Caucasianoid and Negroid, I think are the classifications before what we have now as common term race classifications. But I think the conversation always boils back down to, because that's the gate. If we come in through attacking the governmental laws and structures that dismantle our knowledge of and our perception of and say we were wrong, like we got it wrong, the laws that are set were incorrect in terms of their classifications, then we can't make some of those significant strides that we need to make for the LGBTQ community. For, on the backs of that entry, we'll make other strides. And so the conversation generally boils down to that. But it's also what we're talking about is the marginalized people experience. And in much of our time before, in the 1800s, if you weren't white, you were black. The understanding of who you were, if you were not white, passably white, you were codified as colored. And so I think that's my first attempt at why does it boil down in that way.
Did you want to jump in there?
Well, I was just going to jump to the second question since she
Okay.
answered that one. So I can wait if you want to follow.
Yeah, I guess to extrapolate on that, if you had followed the trajectory of the LGBTQ equality movement, and you looked at the marriage equality movement, which, by the way, a real analysis of that movement is that it is about white male heteronormativity, and it really isn't about queerness at all. That marriage equality movement is about privilege and how to get closer to the center of privilege and power. But that's another topic for another day. And money. But if you follow the trajectory of that movement in court, what you will find is an exact replication of the civil rights work of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, down to the very arguments that were used against interracial marriage.
Yeah.
The exact arguments that were used against interracial marriage were used against LGBTQ people. What the Bible says, it's against the law of God, it's unnatural, and they didn't have a lot of work to do to find answers, right? Because the civil rights movement had already given them the responses that would work in the courts. So they used the blueprint of the civil rights movement. ACT UP is really a reimagining of the Poor People's Campaign, right? So all of this is just the door, the back, the entry point of what it means to be socially progressive. And that's a lot of why the conversation boils down to black and white, because that's been the blueprint for how to make justice movements move forward. And we don't have time to talk about the women's rights, the feminist movement, and the ways in which feminism co-opted and hijacked really civil rights and the civil rights movement and set it back 20 years in progress because it took all the finances out of the movement and brought attention to white women of a certain class because it left out poor white women.
Right.
Feminism in its first wave was a classist and an elitist movement. And so I just wanted to give exact kind of extrapolation on that. Second question, Jean.
Which I think, if I remember, was about white supremacy.
Yes.
Okay. So y'all may have noticed when Bishop Edward Donalson gave my little bio, he mentioned that I graduated from the University of Virginia, which is in Charlottesville, Virginia, which has most recently been in the news because there has been a very visible and very outright display of white supremacy. And so that's the easy answer. The easy answer is there have historically and continue to be groups of people that very outrightly believe that they are superior because they are white. And I've also been thinking, though, about, so I can say, in that definition, I can say I am not a white supremacist. However, I've also been trying to think about Charlottesville and think about myself and white supremacy in light of systems, just how we talk about race as a system.
Yeah.
How can we think about white supremacy as a system?
Right.
And so, for example, I mentioned I graduated from the University of Virginia, which is one of the oldest universities in our country. And at UVA, folks love, and I mean love, to talk about Thomas Jefferson, who founded the University of Virginia, and a very prominent historical figure in our country's history, right? Well, what we don't often talk about, we know it and it's there, but we don't talk about how the University of Virginia is a white supremacist university. There's no way that it can't be. It was founded by Thomas Jefferson, who no doubt was a white supremacist. It lives and breathes in our institution and continues to do so today, but we don't talk about it as a historically white supremacist institution, like we might talk about historically black colleges and universities, right? We just say it's the University of Virginia. So that's kind of been my challenge recently, is to think about what white supremacy means as a system, and then therefore what that means for me. Because if it's a system, then there's no doubt that I'm participating in it. And I need to find ways to recognize that and do something about that. So that's where I'm at with that.
Thank you for lifting that. I'm often asked, if white supremacy is systemic and it's a system, can I point to anything systemically that is still white supremacist? Because we've had the civil rights movement, we've overcome. We've had our first black president, and we now live in a post-racial society. That's the pushback I get. And so I always point to publishing, because I'm an author. 85% of the books published by major publishers in America are written by white, middle-aged men. 85% still white, middle-aged men. It is extremely difficult for a woman to get published, particularly if she's an academic. It's even more difficult for an academic woman to get published. If you are a woman who happens to be black, Latina, Latinx, indigenous, it is almost impossible for you to get published by a major publishing house because the system still prefers rich, land-owning white men. That's how white supremacy works. Now, what does that say to my Asian chocolate daughter when she goes to the bookstore and looks on the bookshelf at the pictures of the author and cannot find herself replicated? So the work that we have to do as parents of this little girl is to find the 10% of authors that look like her and bring them into our home and educate her about her ability and capability and capacity in order for her to have an experience that is normative for white men, right? That's what white supremacy looks like as a system. I really want to say thank you to both of you, ladies, for the tender way in which you engaged the topics this evening. And I want to honor that you both come from very different places. And I want to honor the fact that you brought your whole self to this moment. And I appreciate that and celebrate it very much. We'd like to open it up for questions. If you need a card,
You can raise your hand.
and if you'd like to come to the mic, please feel free.
Everyone. My question is, lately I've been participating in cultural competency trainings at an organization that has been having issues around race and power. And we did an exercise, an icebreaker with the group. And we had people arrange themselves in order of who they thought was most privileged to least privileged. For the white people, it took like 2 seconds. However, for like an hour, the people of color, I'm going to say, they still struggled of how they saw themselves and who was more privileged. So can anyone share some insight on how people of color are dealing with their internalized oppression and also their privilege?
I will start. I'm going to hand it off to you because you do this section in cultural You do this section in cultural competency. But I want to start with something called intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw, a black female attorney, came up, gifted us with that terminology. And what intersectionality originally meant was it is the multiple burdens of a particular individual, and for her it was black women. The multiple burdens of a particular individual and how they navigate those multiple burdens. So if you are a black, poor, female, lesbian woman, your intersectionality collides to make life most unbearable. As juxtaposed to a cisgendered, black, heteronormative male, right? That both have marginalization, both experience oppression. The degree to which one experiences oppression and the degree to which those oppressions work together systemically to make life more challenging, as that black male cisgender in a heteronormative relationship, I have to then say I'm in a place of privilege. And how can I use my privilege responsibly with my sister who is experiencing multiple burdens in ways in this moment that I'm not. And sometimes that just means something as simple as not talking in a room. Because men are given a certain level of unearned respect in many rooms, called male supremacy or male privilege. And you have to know when you're taking up too much space in the room, right? And that's being aware of someone else's intersectionality.
And I think I'll just add on to that and lift the idea of allyship. Because what Dr. Donalson just so eloquently described is this idea of becoming an ally and knowing when you have more power or dominance in a situation than someone else, and you can reach kind of that hand out. I think as an African American woman, seeing my privilege has been a journey over time. I realize I am particularly privileged because of my education. I am particularly privileged because of the socioeconomic status, not only that I am, but to what I grew up in and what was afforded to me and what I was exposed to. And, oftentimes we just want to say, well, no, I've had it tough too. But the reality is, I didn't have a number of those experiences. It doesn't mean that I cannot understand them, empathize, or, we commonly say, kind of put ourselves in those shoes. But there are some things that are so distant from my experience because of my privilege, even distancing my husband and myself. When we drive down the street, our experience of driving in our neighborhood is different because I have a female privilege. When I'm pulled over, I think I told my husband a story. I was coming from the nail salon and my nails weren't completely dry yet. And I pulled out and I was driving like so. Anybody ever done that? So I was driving like so, and the police officer, this is before a lot of shootings were taking place, pulled me over. And, I said, oh, hi, officer. And he says to me, I'd like to see your license and registration. And my response was completely natural. But in my feminine self, I looked at him with a quick bat.
Let me check about that bat.
I looked at him with a quick bat and I said, oh my, I really want to provide for you what you're asking. However, I hope you'll appreciate this, that my nails are wet. And so, quite unable to give you my license at this point. And I said, but let me grab my pocketbook. And if you'll just take it, he's like, ma'am. I cannot. And I said, no, officer, you don't understand. Either you're going to give me a ticket or you're not. But this nail polish, I can't mess up. My next appointment is in 2 weeks. So I'm going to need to, this is more permanent. So I lifted up my purse and put it to the window. And he says, you're just like my wife, give it here. And he got it out, and I was like, whatever, you did what I wanted you to do. And I realized in my feminine self that I had a privilege that my husband, he could bat an eye if he wants to. I think his eyelashes are cute, but the police officer may not feel the same way. And I use that story just to codify my intersectionality, that I am very aware of when to use with privilege. At the University of Washington, it's still, even though we have a lot of women in power, it's still very male-dominated. And there are times where I have to speak truth to power. And I have to choose when I use my educated black woman self, and when I decide to use my feminine energy to make a point and to gain what I want to gain. And some of you may think, ooh, that's usury. No, I'm gifted in those areas with my intersectionality. And because my intersectionality had become, they're marginalized, I use them for my advantage. And I use them to be an ally for women who don't maybe look like me or have the same experience.
Okay, I hope we kind of touched around. Okay, anyone else? Well, come on. This is a UW student coming down working on his master's. Come on.
Almost over. So my question, hi all. My question is this, I'm an actor. I went to see a play, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which is adapted from Maya Angelou's book. And after the show, I met with saw a director in the lobby that I've worked with. She's a white woman. She said to me, and me and my black male friend, she said, you know, it was a great show, the audience was okay, but we've got to get more of your people out. And I guess my question is, and so I didn't say anything, I didn't respond in like any kind of way. I was like, okay, you know, and then she's like, yeah, she's like, I mean, good audiences, this is a great play, but we've got to get your people out. Like she said it again. At which point I said, yeah, we need more church people. You know, and so, because church people are my people. And so I guess I was just asking, like, when it comes to something that is like you definitely feel like, you know, like moved, like that it's uncomfortable racially, and it's with a white person and someone that you want to work with for a long time, and you want to correct them, and in the moment you can't like think of like what to say, or like how can I like really like you just said, speak truth to power. Like I was just kind of like, and even afterwards, like I should have said this, I should have said that, but I was just, and I feel like there's so many instances that I'm just like so baffled that I don't actually know what to say.
I'd love to take the pressure off you and say that it's not your job to educate ignorant folk. And I think sometimes that when we, and off of all of us, sometimes we feel like, oh, it's our job. The heavens have opened and given us this poor lost soul to educate in this moment. And I think approaching those moments just as you did with grace. There's something very powerful about exercising gracious space, thinking about how you would like to be handled in that moment, and the amount of silence that you gave as an awkward pause before you then came with the quip of, oh, church people, right? Then says to her to check herself the next time she makes an assumption or presumption. Or it even opens the door for her to come to you later and say, you know, I might have misspoken. And I really want to make sure that things are okay with us. And what I meant was, I'd like more African American people to be here. Do you have an avenue that I could tap in, right? So our point isn't to cut people off and to get them together, but to invite them into that space where they can ask questions that they feel safe with us. So we want to handle them with care, but also not feel the burden to give the complete history lesson in that moment.
Well, I'm sorry that she said that. I'll just speak sort of from something that came to mind for me as a white person from your question. I hope that she comes back around and talks to you about that and addresses what she said. And I also know that my tendency as a white person and our tendency as a whole as white people is to not do that. Is to sort of be like, oh, well, I don't want to seem like I messed up. And I am trying to learn that I mess up and to own that I mess up and then to address that and not try to ignore it or run from it. So I hope that that's what she does, and that's something that I know I am working on, and I encourage the rest of my white folk to also be okay with messing up, because we do, and that's hard, especially for us white women, because we are conditioned to not mess up, and we've got to work against that, we really do.
So I'd like to applaud your use of humor. I also want to give you permission to use rage, because we are disallowed as minoritized men in particular to express disapproval. And it's okay sometimes to say, what you just said, inappropriate. Now the other thing, now you gave a caveat. You gave a caveat, and you want to work with her. You want to work with her, so let me give you another tool. Right? But I just want to lift up that rage is also an okay emotion, particularly in our socio-political climate, that it is okay to say, you have offended me.
Yeah.
But because you said you want to work with her again, and you want relationship, right? An invitation vis-a-vis questioning is always another helpful tool. So she says, we need to get more of your people here. And your response might be, why so? Why do you say so? And by my people, you mean, right? Invite them into the space to share their thought, because from the sounds of it, there was no ill will. And there was no ill intent, right? But there was hurt. And my wife tells me you have to, what's it say now? You got to, about the impact and the intent.
Impact.
Say what you say.
Impact versus intent, I
Right.
think is what he's talking about.
That's what I'm talking about.
And so it really doesn't matter our intent when the impact is tremendous, right? So I think that sometimes we want people to judge us on our intention, but we judge them on their impact. And so we have to know that that's a two-way street. And people really don't know your intentions, right? That's that internal thing that's happening that drives us.
So you invite the question because there has been impact, right? And say, I'd really like to talk about that. To what end? We would like to have more Black people. To what end? What's your goal? Because I could possibly help you, right? So inviting the question is important. There was another question. I saw two hands. Come, please come.
Hello all. So I have a question. I am a former youth pastor. And so I have to navigate some heavy spaces as it pertains to youth, and particularly Black male youth. And so when they ask me questions, as we talk about this whole condition thing, right? So you say, we've been conditioned for this, and these different subgroups have been conditioned for this and that. When I think of the conditioning of the Black man, I think of us being conditioned to die, right? And so it's actually quite frightening to look a Black man in the face, a 14-year-old child, and say, well, actually, in this world, you either die fighting, right? Or, you die fighting in something like the Civil Rights Movement, and you are conditioned, something like, MLK and all these other people, to die, or you die on a street corner, because there also you are conditioned to die. And so it's kind of disheartening, and I guess I would like to ask and put the question in this space of how we, as a community, because it is not purposed for us to do these things, but it is conditioned, right? So how do we navigate these spaces with these young people and say, condition is different than purpose, and and with all this racism and with all this extra that's going on, like what hope, I guess, could you all give these young people? Because ultimately I've seen, literally in the past year, multiple black men, young people killed, not on a TV, you know, not in another country, another state, but I've seen people who came to my youth group, right? And so I guess I would like to know, even from you amazing people out here, how you interact with, you know, your brothers and sisters that are from another race, and how you bring comfort to them as you help them to walk through their own journeys.
I think my first stab at this, and of course passing it along, is that the conditioning you talk about is something we commonly call socialization. And so I think that one of the ways to combat the conditioning is to work with the way that we socialize men and women to be in the world. And much of what we socialize becomes such a part of the fabric of who we are, but we can change that early on. Dr. Donalson and I did an experiment with our daughter, with Hevania. I mean, we have other children that we have adopted, that we have, right? And we weren't in charge of their rearing from a very early age, but then influenced them over time. But with Hevania, we thought particularly we were going to raise an emotionally intelligent being. And so we did things particularly in her socialization that would not be normative of, you know, because she's a girl, girls do this, or boys do this, or this is some, you know, one thing or another. And we purposely gave her other examples. But this hope thing is one that really weighs on my heart. I've never been a black man, and I've never been a black man. It's good to say that because I could be transgender, and I want to acknowledge that, but I am not. Well, he's distracting. I'm not a black man, and I am a mother of black sons, and so they weigh heavy on my heart, and and an aunt of black nephews, and to watch their experience to become apathetic would be the tendency. And so to continue to inspire hope is to continue to give them a picture of a preferred future, while also wrestling with where they are now. And I think that's interesting that that conditioning keeps coming up, because we have so much more control over that conditioning than we think through socialization.
So here's my moment of transparency. I have no idea how to do what you asked. I don't. And part of my being here tonight and doing what we're doing is because somebody's got to have an answer. And so creating venues and creating spaces like this to have these open conversations and to start the dialogue is a best attempt at starting that hope process. I would like to think that as a pastor, teacher, teaching different archetypes of masculinity and tropes of masculinity so that the warrior is not the only way young black men know how to be men.
Right.
That has been an effort, but I don't know that I'm successful yet. But my effort is to say that you can be a warrior, or you can be a king, or you can be a jester, or you can be a magician, or you can be a lover, and you are still a black man.
That's right.
And you don't have to believe the mass media tropes and stereotypes and archetypes of what masculinity looks like, because you don't have to die in this fight. You can be smart enough to live to fight another day. And so that has been a part of my strategy for that, for hope giving, is to set really high expectations, really incredibly high expectations, and then to give them enough information to know that they can reach those expectations on multiple roads.
Right.
I think one of the things that we've done internally in our community is we have said this is what it means to be a man in ways that limit self-expression. And as much as we have worried about external killers, it's been some of the internal narratives about not being good enough, not being strong enough, not being warrior enough, that has caused our young men to make choices and decisions that put them in life-ending spaces and places. So I don't know.
But yeah, like, so the very first time I teach high school, and I was at a predominantly school of marginalized people. And the first movie I showed when I was absent was Love Jones.
Yes, come on.
First Love, right? Like Love Jones, most of y'all probably haven't seen it. But the kids were like, oh my gosh, there is a different way. I've never seen a black love story.
Wow.
Right? Like, it was here in Seattle. They were like, I've never seen anything like this. This was last year.
Wow.
Wow.
Right? So like, just showing them something different. Right? Like, giving them those different perspectives. Like, cause, I mean, I never thought I would live in Seattle. I'm from Florida. Like, what the hell am I doing in Seattle? I still don't know. Still don't know. It's okay. Still don't know. It's good. I like y'all. So that helps. But just keep showing them something different. And you might lose a few.
Yeah.
But you don't know how many more you'll save.
That's right.
That's what I found. So that was my answer to that. And then my question, it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. And so we've been going through, so Seattle Public Schools has the highest quote-unquote achievement gap between black and white students, black and Hispanic students. It's like 50 points, it's the highest in the nation. And so they have been intentional in doing race equity training and training teachers about implicit biases this year's code word, implicit bias. And that, mind you, we've only been in school 2 weeks, 2 weeks tomorrow. And the last week, one of the kids, or one of the teachers came to me and said, I know you're having trouble with this kid. And I was like, what? Which one? Who are you talking about? And he was like, I know you're having trouble with this kid. And I was like, no, he tried to throw a paper airplane on the first day, but we nipped that in the bud. I told him, don't throw the paper airplane. That was my high expectation. Right? I was just like, don't do it. I see you contemplating it, just don't. Matter of fact, just bring it to me so you aren't tempted. Right? Like, he was fine. Then he was suspended for marijuana possession. And it broke my heart. I literally sent an email to everybody on that chain like, damn it. Like, we were doing such good work. He was coming to my class. He gave me no issues. He participated. He was doing everything that I was asking him to do. And still, 2 weeks into school, he's suspended. Right? And then it goes to, I started to think about, okay, so this white supremacy idea, like, how is it showing up? And it goes into our values.
That's right.
It's everything that we value and say that it's good. We legalize marijuana, just not for kids.
Right.
It's available everywhere, but don't you do it. Testing. We value testing. If you test well, you're smart and you're good, and somehow, I mean, you could be on coke, heroin, which my kids are, right? But if you test well, none of that matters. And so it shows up every single day in everything that we do. And the things that we say are, oh, that's good and that's bad. And we don't even think about it. When we talk about prayer as a way to overcome financial challenges, we aren't even thinking about how tough that could be for someone and how oppressive that statement even is. Like, it's in every single thing that we do and say and articulate and try to figure out and finesse. And that's what I'm feeling. And I needed to release that. So I'm sorry for dumping, but that's just where I am with this conversation.
Thank you for speaking your truth.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I heard you name in this space is the fact that our systems are set up over against what we purport to value. And so therefore we reinforce or reinscribe failure narratives. And so, you know, we've got to tackle that, particularly the Seattle Public School District. The whole system compels me. It's quite problematic because of the ways that we set up over against. Like, we know that children need to remain in school to reach them, but yet we suspend them.
And then you don't allow them to come back unless they go to treatment. When you're poor, you're not going to treatment. Your
Exactly.
parents are working.
Because you're working.
If you're affluent, your parents are going to get you a treatment so you can get out your hair. Right? And that is my biggest...
No, it's so right that you have that amount of rage, because the rage will fuel you to impact the system. So you're not just sitting in the tomorrow is early dismissal, it's teacher preparation time, and you're not just sitting compliant in that time, but you're using your rage to speak over and against the policies that we construct that work against us. And this is what happens with norms all the time. I work with people who say, oh, these teams are horrible, these people are, this isn't working. And I'm like, well, what are the norms in your area? And they're so interesting because our norms reinscribe the narratives that are permissible, that allow behavior that we say is deplorable, but we keep reinscribing the narrative. If we say that, you know, our meetings start on time, then every time someone comes late to a meeting, you start over, you're telling them it's totally okay for you to come late. You're not going to miss anything because we're going to catch you up. Right? So in that same way, we do the same thing with various systems.
So you, Killing Rage, Ending Racism by Bell Hooks. I would like to offer that up as a resource. I think Bell will be a wonderful conversation partner for you. And not just Killing Rage. Yeah, you know Bell. Okay, so you know Ms. Hooks is a wonderful conversation partner. As we talked about systemic issues with young black men, I want to offer up critical race theory. And I would invite you to really unpack and dive into critical race theory so that you will be able to arm yourself with tools specific to you to do that work. And in a nutshell, critical race theory says that racism is permanent and it is intrinsic to the fabric of what it means to be in this society. So it is never shocking, it is never unmooring, it is never surprising. The verdict just came down in St. Louis, and the policeman was acquitted. And you had all this evidence and all of this, and then people said, oh, we're so shocked. And I thought, really? You're shocked? In St. Louis, Missouri, again. We're not shocked. It's Michael Brown. It's Trayvon Martin. It's, you name it, all the way back to, let's go back to Rodney King. Like we learned that video evidence, recorded evidence, does not make for, convictions in our justice system. We know this. This isn't new. So what critical race theory does is it gives you the ability to analyze these circumstances through racism as a societal norm, not as a justice matter, but as a normative thing in American society that needs to be addressed. And until we can center that conversation, that what we're experiencing has become normative, we're gonna really struggle. We're gonna struggle until we realize that hate speech is being normalized
Right.
from the highest office in the nation.
It's so true.
It's being normalized. It's being centered. And until we really embrace that truth, we won't be able to dismantle the systems of oppression that have collided to allow it to be so. I think we have time for one more question. If there's anyone, we're right up against the... Were there any on cards? Were there any cards that we... Well, thank you all. You have been absolutely amazing to sit with and to share with. And thank you for allowing us to dialogue with one another and to dialogue with you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, all three of you. It was, I guess I do have a question, and maybe towards you. Conversations like this make me feel very shameful because I'm white. And so and I guess it's for all three of you, because I know with what that woman said to you, God, I hope it wasn't intentional, that she was just stupid. However, I'm sure that I have said things without realizing it to marginalized people, to people that look like me, and sometimes things come out of our mouth. But how do I move from shame to action? You know, how do I quit feeling bad because I'm white and I know I'm privileged? You know, I got that a long time ago, so I'm aware of that. But then what do I do with that?
Yeah, shame is powerful. Shame is powerful. So I can share a few things that I am trying and see if maybe they're helpful for you. One thing we know is that shame doesn't really help us. So I think kind of to what our conversation has been, the more that we can normalize, as painful as that might be, the more that we can normalize our actions and normalize how we think, how we see the world as privileged, as white, as racist, then the less shocked we'll be, the less, the less shamed we might be when it happens, because it's going to happen. Another thing that's been really invaluable for me is to find other white people that you can have a conversation with. So there's no point in running from the shame. If you're feeling shame, to tell you to not feel shame isn't going to help you not feel shame. But finding other white people that you can say, oh my gosh, I did this, and I feel terrible, and I just want to never leave my house again. And someone who you can trust and who can also say in that moment, okay, like maybe don't leave your house for an hour, but then you're okay and maybe go do something about it. But we need other people. We need other people to help us kind of see outside of ourselves sometimes. And so finding, and there are always, there's always a community out there. I'm actually part of a Facebook community right now that's for white folks who are trying to heal from the hurt and pain that white supremacy is dealing us and others, but if we gotta deal with it in ourselves. And it's been a beautiful space. People go on there and say, oh, I did this thing, and like I feel awful, and I feel like I can't do this anymore. And then other white folks respond and say, yeah, I get that, you can do it. we've got to be around other white people who encourage us to move forward, so we don't get stuck.
I'd also like to, did you have an answer?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit.
Please do.
Great. Yeah, I think my response is sort of related to what you were saying before about not being surprised. I think the shame is associated with the judgment, the same judgments that's pointed externally, right? So when the young man shares the comment that was made, and the response is, I hope she was just stupid, then it indicates the judgment that's associated, like this is something that a stupid person would do. And so I think that there's the creation of this arrogant distance that causes folks to be surprised when these things come out. I don't have, I don't get surprised when white people say stupid, reckless stuff to me. Why wouldn't? Why? I mean, in the country that we live in the history that's here, there is no reason for me to reasonably expect that I can go a day in my life without experiencing some manifestation of white supremacy. That is normal for me. It's not an aberration. It's not an exception. It is my reality. And so I think the shame comes from establishing this arrogant distance which says I am in a position where I wouldn't say something like that. I wouldn't do something like that. So I think that's kind of has something to do with what Jean was saying about normalizing it, not saying that it's okay, but saying that there's no reason for me to be surprised when I say something that's consistent with the way that I have been habituated and conditioned by everything that I've ever experienced in this country for my entire life. So yeah, the way that we respond to those things when we see them in other people is the way that is indicative of the way that we react to it in ourselves. So if we don't judge it as this shocking aberration when we see it outside of ourselves, then we might not be as surprised when we see it in ourselves. And then when we do, we might be able to respond as, okay, yep, did it again today, how do I do better? So don't be surprised by it. Don't be shocked by it. It's not the clown jumping out of the closet. It's just you. So don't run from it. Don't hide. Don't lock yourself in and say, there's me again. Being the me. It's so, that's it.
While she's coming, I do want to offer you some hope. I meant to address something that you said, and I heard you. When you said about prayer, we say prayer will change finances. And it will, and so particularly unique to New Thought, that's been a feedback and a pushback from within the movement for a long time. And I have been in conversation and in space, and help me remember the acronym for the governing body, just AGENT. I've been in conversation and in space with AGENT where were we in, guys?
You're in South Carolina, right?
No, Louisiana, New Orleans, with David Alexander and
Flounder and
Ken Gordon. And AGENT's entire executive board is coming together with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries to have specific and unique conversation around doing justice work. Because the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, which is largely an LGBTQIA organization, knows how to do justice, and AGENT has some money. And if we can marry money with the message, we can have a movement. But you need to know that the governing board is conscious and aware that moving consciousness also has an embodiment part. And so I wanted to give you that hope and lift that up, that it is happening. It's not just happening locally at Genesis, it's happening in the entire New Thought movement.
So I'm not coming from
for just a few years that is black. And example, we were just walking downtown Seattle, enjoying, and I talked to everybody. You know, this woman, I love your dress, little puppy, talked to the puppy. And so he explained to me later that he's a large black man, that he walks invisible. And I'm understanding little by little about what his life has been like. And just like you said, you know, that was normal for you. Shame, or was it coming from shame? I didn't feel that I had said something negative to that person. I was just kind of, what? I just didn't understand. And they said, well, you're right. You were privileged. You've always been. But I just haven't been around as many black people. And so I haven't learned to interact and be educated. Because, you know, like this particular person did definitely have a different life than mine. So, I'm not sure if I explained this.
I want to thank you for that articulation, because I think that sometimes we think that we have to have it all together before we have these conversations or even have notions of thought. And I appreciate the fact that you distanced yourself from shame. And I would like to name this space as some curiosity. And I think that to the extent, because it isn't just that white folk mess up in this space. Everybody messes up in this space. We're all learning how to handle ourselves and how well to handle other people. And that notion is emotional intelligence, and we all need it. And so to the extent that we can use our shame to motivate us, see, I don't sit on the other side and saying, oh, we don't need to feel shame. Yeah, sometimes a healthy little dose of shame causes us to change our behavior.
Right.
And some of the reason that we're in the predicament we're in now in our country is because folks aren't shamed. When I did things when I was a child growing up, there was some community shaming. My mother would tell the community, did you know that Ujima did da-da-da? And people would say, do you know who you are? I mean, I can't believe, did you know that Ujima did? And I would be so ashamed that I would do something different. And it's not as though those people attached that to me and my character as a person. They attached it to behavior that allowed it to roll off and for me to change my behavior. So to use a little bit of that shame to motivate and to prick you, that's self-awareness. And we want to become more aware. And when we move from the space of self-awareness, we can become more self-regulated. When we're self-regulated, we manage our motivation. When we manage our motivation, we become empathetic. And when we're empathetic, then we have social intelligence. Daniel Goldman codifies that as emotional intelligence.
So I want to thank you all for being here. I hope you'll come back next month. This is a free event. However, there is a love offering basket in the back, and any gifts that you give will go to our three presenters that are here tonight. So thank you all. I hope to see you in a month. Next month, we're going to talk about experiences. So thank you all for being here.